Uh, Carlene, it's great that you start out with a good question, what I did in my academic career 40 years ago. So I can reassure you that Wellesley was a great academic resource, and I attended several classes there and learned quite a bit. So I always appreciate the opportunity to have a broad learning experience. My topic today is looking forward, where we are now and what it teaches us about where we might be over the next few years. I'd like to take a moment and look backward, if I may. And, I can't see my slides here, so I trust that someone can see them. Carlene, have you all got my slides on the screen? Open gallery view. All right, then I see, very good, I can see you all see them. So what I'd like to do is, if you could, is celebrate a little bit of what we have accomplished so far. And if you could take a look at the next slide, please. This is a quote from Joe Gross from the CMA last year. And I think it's so important that we pay careful attention to the accomplishments of the industry as we look forward to this turbulent future. Remember that we've successfully managed a remarkable turnaround in terms of the industry's sulfur emissions, airborne sulfur emissions. You remember last year when we met that the ability of the industry to cope with the 2020 sulfur requirements was very much a question. There had been an incredible amount of planning going on, but no one really knew what was going to go on. Everyone had the feeling it was going to be a very expensive phenomenon, and indeed, in January, it looked like it was going to be very expensive. But take a look at and since that time, the industry demonstrated that it was able to master the transition. And starting in January 1st of this year, we reduced our airborne sulfur emissions 7-fold. We're saving lives. I think we've got to celebrate that, not just as our contribution to human health and the climate, but also the industry's resilience and ability to adapt to significant changes in the regulatory and climate environment. The human health environment is, of course, the focus of the sulfur emissions. So, Joe, thank you very much for giving me this great quote last year and for permission to use it again. I think, indeed, I think we should be proud and reflect on that accomplishment as we look forward to what might be happening next. Next slide, please. So what I want to do today is talk very quickly about some of the key issues that we look at when we discuss with our clients about where the shipping industry might be going. What are some of the decisions that are going to be made? I think Angus put it so well. Now is the time for decisions. We know important decisions are being made right now. I want to highlight to you where the shipping industry is going to see the consequences of those decisions and where our decisions internally are going to make a huge difference going forward. So let me start with the pandemic and the economic shutdown that we have just seen and talk a little bit about what that has done to our industry. Next slide, please. So this chart is how the IMF describes our economy in very, very broad terms, of course. It is the growth of global GDP. And we've got data here back from 2008, nicely timed to show the financial crisis and the most recent global recession. And then you see in 2020, the sharp collapse that the IMF sees is basically at this stage remains a forecast for 2020. And what I like to highlight when we see this chart is this V-shaped recovery, the very robust growth in 2021. Now that's what the IMF has recently announced. They're going to be updating this forecast as we see them going forward. By the way, that kind of horizontal line that you see there is a forecast prepared in October 2019 before the pandemic hit. You can see that the IMF had a fairly positive view for the global economy. It's worth noting that even this V-shaped recovery that they see in this post-pandemic forecast doesn't bring us back to the level of economic activity that they had anticipated in October of 2019. So let's talk a little bit about how this macro view is developing. We see two things going on. First of all, again, at a very high level, the 2020 is looking less bad than people feared. And I think it's very important to recognize that we have seen progress in opening up the economy. Depending on how you measure it, we've certainly come off the bottom, I think, by any standard here in the US. No doubt about that in China. China led the world. Latin America is a surprise, as is the rest of Asia. So we're seeing a less and less bad outcome for 2020. And so we're going to be able to baseline our numbers, I think, from a little higher pace of growth in 2020 than we had previously seen. On the other hand, our confidence is falling in the V, or the extent of the V, we're going to see in 2021. The quandary that the European economies face as they struggle to reopen, struggle to control the pandemic, and control the consequences of Brexit are enormous. And frankly, we're seeing many of those same issues here in the United States as we try to send the kids back to school, to reopen our businesses. I'm not sure we have a clear path forward to that 5% growth rate that we see there. And so that we're tempering our longer term view at the same time we're improving our assessment of where we are right now and where we're going to be over the next few months, several months of the year. But now let's drill down and take a look at how this has affected shipping. Next slide, please. What this chart shows you is the change in trade volumes between 2019, for which we have pretty good historical data by this stage. We know 2019, and our forecast of 2020. Now here, of course, it's a forecast. We don't know the last few months of the year, and in the case of the container ship business, we're still gathering information about actual volumes of world trade. But what it shows is the dry bulk market for the tanker market, the container ship and LNG market, where we think we're going to have seen those trade volumes change over the course of the 12 months in 2020 versus 2019. So let's take a look first at those rightmost three bars, the oil trade, the containerized trade, and LNG trade. The shrinkage, the collapse in global trade. And collapse is not too strong a word to use in the tanker side in terms of world trade. This mirrors really what we saw in the first years of the 80s, where we saw the second oil price crisis and OPEC's limits on its production there. The strongest that we have seen really since that time. Containerized trade, LNG trade, we haven't seen anything like what are the projected declines here. And so the pandemic has had significant consequences. Not so surprisingly, those consequences have been most felt in the oil side, where we know the aviation industry as well as transportation generally has been hit very hard. Sooner or later, we're going to go back to our offices, and I trust we'll be able to go to conferences again, but that looks like it might be 6 or 8 months down the road as things now stand. But let's take a look at the dry bulk market. Remarkably, the dry bulk market, dry bulk trade looks like it's set to grow this year relative to last year. That was certainly not the case in the first quarter of the year, but we've seen a rapid rebound in China. And so we're expecting that that will continue at least for the rest of this year. And we actually saw a modest pace of growth there. So the pandemic has had serious consequences for the shipping industry across the board. To celebrate 1% growth in the dry bulk market is not the message of this chart. It's really to see that we've had some severe consequences to deal with, unprecedented in many cases. Next slide, please. Now, the fascinating thing for me, and of course, the huge business issue for the shipping industry, is how those changes in demand have been reflected in changes in the earnings and asset values of our industry. There's some very important lessons to be learned here. This chart adds to the trade growth chart. It adds the change in rates, average time charter rates between the change in the average of time charter rates between 2020 and 2019. So you see in the dry bulk market, the rates fell by about 11%. The tanker market, they increased by 16%. Those of you who remember the first half of the year think that's way undershooting. Of course, the second half of the year looks a lot less positive. Container ship rates fell by about 7%, and LNG by 22%, time charter rates. So why this incredible disparity in rates, and how to interpret this? Well, let's kind of walk through the key factors. First of all, of course, fleet growth. Fleet growth remains a huge issue for the industry, somewhat surprisingly, as fleet growth has slowed down. In 2020, we anticipate by the end of the year, the dry bulk fleet is going to be between 3 and 4% larger than it was at the end of 2019. Same thing roughly for the tanker fleet and the container ship fleet. It's the LNG fleet, which is growing fast, and in fact, their expectations of rapid growth in LNG trade last year were met by rapid growth, or aligned with rapid growth in the fleet, which we expect will grow by 7%. So on the LNG side, I think we pretty much know the story. Very rapid fleet growth on top of a shrinking trade means that you get a significant decline in rates in a relatively thin market. On the dry bulk market, the story's a little bit more complicated. We had modest growth in trade. We have relatively high growth in the fleet. There was one more part of the story, though, and that is, if you all remember, at the end of 2019, as part of the preparation for change that Joe summarized for us so well, we were installing a lot of scrubbers on our fleet and pulling a lot of the Capes in particular, and even the Panamaxes in some cases, out of the fleet, out of the trade, in order to put scrubbers on board. That retrofitting strategy had the consequence of in effect, reducing the fleet and inflating the rates at the time. Now that has pretty much passed. So the impact of the scrubber retrofits is behind us. And so that factor added to the pressure on rates that we've seen in 2020. The big surprises really are in the tanker and the container ship market. So let's take a look at those blue bars on the tanker side. What happened there? Well, the answer is that in this crisis, in the pandemic crisis, when we saw a huge drop in demand at one point in time, oil demand had fallen to the level of a decade ago. So a huge decline in demand. At the same time, OPEC, or rather the Saudis, declared war on U.S. shale production and other cheating OPEC members, who they perceived as overproducing. So at the same time we saw the economy go into a tailspin, we saw Saudis unleash their oil production. And that oil had to go somewhere. Even though there was no demand for it, or the demand was declining, it went first into onshore storage, then it went into offshore floating storage. And that floating storage actually increased, more than offset the decline in the demand for oil. And we saw a sharp rise in the total demand for tankers through the floating storage. And that had a very sharp impact on rates, particularly obviously in the first half of this year. Now, that's being wound down pretty rapidly. And we expect to see that the rates are going to continue to suffer from the winding down. But remember those good days. 6 months of good rates is pretty impressive, and that's important to remember. But perhaps the most interesting case is the container ship market. This is a market which traditionally has not managed cycles very well. It often sees sharp declines in rates. So how is it that we saw a relatively modest 7% decline? By the way, I think we're probably, given the way the rates are moving at the end of the year, we might see much less decline in average rates in 2020 than we're now seeing, so maybe less than 7%. Well, the container ship, the liner industry learned how to manage capacity. It finally, after years and years of failing to do so, it finally managed capacity, blank sailings, pulling ships out of trades, managed to keep rates high. And we've also begun to see a robust recovery in demand here in the fourth quarter, as we begin to see that perhaps the macro consequences of the pandemic are not quite so bad as we feared. So we're seeing a range of responses across the industry and a range of factors as they're flowing in. Looking forward, I think on the demand side, as I say, we remain positive about the outlook for the industry, although our confidence, our sense of the strength of that recovery is declining. But there's going to be a lot else going on. It doesn't get to be a simple linear world like that. So let's take a look at some of the other factors that are driving the industry right now. Next slide, please. Again, I just want to thank Angus for pointing out so well the significance of decarbonization for our industry. I don't think I'm being bold to say that decarbonization will change the world. Even the use of the word decarbonization has extraordinary power. It means we're not just consuming less, emitting less CO2, we're not emitting any CO2. It shines a light on all the corners of the market. Frankly, what the IMO does in that regard is although it's very important, it sets a regulatory standard. I think it's very, very important to see how the industry has responded. We heard about the Poseidon Principles earlier. This is the first reporting year. Next month, we're actually going to see the bank's carbon profile, their carbon footprint of their shipping loans, their shipping portfolio. That will be an interesting read, I'm sure. And there's a great scramble to actually get those numbers together. I can guarantee you that, as we see it ourselves. The Sea Cargo Charter. The Sea Cargo Charter, amazingly enough, is an alignment of charterers who attempt to do the same thing for their portfolio, their chartering portfolio, as the banks did for their lending portfolio. Now, amazingly enough, they've chosen a very different metric, and they've applied it in a very different way. So the Sea Cargo Charter is taking us down a more complex, and I think, frankly, from a data side, much more challenging execution program to see the Sea Cargo Charter achieve the same results as the Poseidon Principles. And there's a host of other initials that are coming out: EEXI, CII, and Trafigura just changed the world, by the way. The bunker levy, which we kind of gotten comfortable might start out at $2 a ton on the bunker oil, Trafigura has just proposed $1,000 a ton. And they present a well-reasoned argument as to why that's the minimum necessary to achieve decarbonization in our industry when we have no fuels that can, in fact, emit zero carbon. The IMO, as a result, is scrambling to put together some short-term operational factors that the industry can rely on, as Angus noted, in his chartering behavior. There's more, and I'm sorry, there's a lot going on here. BP has really, I think, shocked the world in many ways by saying we are past peak oil demand, that we may not recover. Demand may not recover to 2019 level. They see scenarios which they find difficult to assign probabilities to, but they want to highlight to us that we may be on a path of slow decline and then accelerating decline in oil demand over the next 10 years. So as we look forward, what does the shipping industry have to be prepared to do? We need to be prepared to bring these things into our planning process, into our at least thinking through the possibility that these scenarios are going to be important. And I think two very important scenarios that you need to think about. First, of course, the BP scenario. We are at peak oil demand and falling. Most will say that that decline is happening after 2030, and maybe 2035 is when we see it a lot. 2035 is 15 years away. If you're thinking about building a new tanker today, you've just paid off about half of its life by 2035. You need to think about some of the points that are coming out of the Global Maritime Forum as we have in parallel those discussions about reducing the cost of retrofit and possibly looking at life extension as a more and more important strategy for the industry. All these factors are going to be very important as we look forward, and we can quantify them, and they're going to drive some short-term decisions. So let me take you now through the last slide of the presentation and show you some of those short-term decisions that are going to be made. Next slide, please. First of all, it's a terrible sin, and I have to apologize to everyone that I've just presented a wall of numbers. Those of you who are participating on your iPhones may find these numbers difficult to read. So let me just start tell you what this is about. This is the fleet growth indicators. Remember, I told you that how important a role the rapid growth in the fleet played in the decline of rates in almost all the markets that we were looking at earlier. Well, looking forward, and this is no new news, really, I think we're seeing that the order book to fleet ratio in the leftmost column there is at historical lows for most of the markets, between 5% for product tankers and a high of 9% for the container ship trade. If you take a look on the far right, expected fleet growth, this is Marsoft's forecast of fleet growth over the next 4 years. You see that we're seeing below single-digit growth rates in the crude tanker market and single-digit rates in the product tanker and the dry bulk market. Now, with that kind of very slow growth, we can see, even in the context of slow macro growth and slow recovery in the economy, we can see that the markets have possibly a foundation for a sustained recovery beginning second half of next year. That's very important, and we think that this is really going to set the stage for the change in the industry. But let me now take a look at the column next to the right there, the portion of fleet between age 15 and 19. This is what we all need to watch. 20% of the crude tanker fleet is between 15 and 19. Those crude tankers face few prospects for chartering under current behavior in the market after the age of 20. 20% of that fleet is going to be scrapped or thereabouts, a little bit less, because some do live beyond the age of 20. And there's going to be a question about how are those ships replaced. If we see tanker owners rushing to invest in new buildings at this stage, I think probably the same old lessons of the market and how we get to a continuous excess capacity will be driving the industry going forward. If we see a change, if we see that owners hold off on that new building program, instead look at retrofits, new building, and even try as an alternative to new building, and trying to push beyond the mystical 20-year barrier, I think we're going to see the change in the industry, that we deserve and that we should see because of the changed circumstances. And that's going to create significantly more positive view for us going forward. Next slide, please. I'm afraid I haven't given you a lot of answers, and frankly, I don't think that there's a lot of black and white answers we can give you now. We have to shade our answers in terms of probabilities and expectations. The recovery from the worst economic crisis the world has seen since the Great Depression is uncertain, but the capacity of our industry to respond proactively, to make money under adverse circumstances remains something that is going to drive us going forward. I think the discussions that Carleen and Angus have kicked off today are exactly the ones that we need to set the pace, choose how we're going to make better decisions going forward. Look forward to being part of those. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Hello and welcome to Shipping Insight TV. I'm Baba Waters, and joining me is my colleague and co-anchor, Huge Downs. Huge,
good morning,
what did
everybody.
you think about what Arlie had to present for us today?
I think it was very interesting. I learned quite a few things there. Stumbled across a couple, but being in the shipping industry for many, many years, I could see changes. And it looks like Arlie sees the same changes coming on down the line. Thank you, Arlie, for that presentation.
Well, we were very pleased, but a little disappointed that Arlie went to Wellesley to study rather than enjoy some of the social aspects of Wellesley. We're moving on to our next panel, which is the Decade of Decarbonization. And it is hosted by ABS, and our chief correspondent is Keegan Plaxton. Keegan, take it away.